Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, as always, and today I'm joined by Dr. Marco Del Giudice. For a third time, this will be our second interview about the evolutionary psychology of sex differences. For you who don't know Dr. Del Giudice, he is Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of New Mexico, and basically last time we covered a couple of 4 or 5 topics. We talked about personality, different kinds of analysis that we can make, the interpersonal circumplex model, cooperation and competition in males and females, and gender differences in communication. And today we're going to focus on some other more general topics. We're not going to talk about, for example, mating and sexuality. We will start with play in males and females and then go over, for example, gender stereotypes, theories that explain the origins of sex differences, animal comparisons, and then evolutionary explanations to all of these. And those are basically the topics that we're going to cover today. And Dr. Del Giudice, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show again. It's always a pleasure to everyone. Okay, so let's start with play then, as I said. So play, I guess, plays a very important role, particularly I would say in mammals, because it's a sort of preparation for what they will be dealing with in the future. For example, in other animals, let's pick the example of lions. They have that kind of rough and tumble play to prepare also to go looking to catch prey later on and to protect themselves in fights and things like that. So in the case of humans specifically, what are the differences in how boys and girls play?
Right. So, I mean, yeah, that's important. Humans spend a lot of time playing. Children spend a lot of time playing when they can. And not just that, I mean, one thing that's kind of unique about humans is how long we keep playing, even as adults. So it's not just something that kids do at a certain stage of their life, but it's, we maintain the ability to play, and that probably has something to do with our, curiosity and ability to innovate on a cultural level and so on. So the big picture about sex differences in play, the first thing is, there's some patterns. One big pattern is physical activity, where you have boys tend to be more physically active than girls, and this is from very, very early on. And it kind of pervades a bit the whole pattern of sex differences. It could be just possibly even prenatal, so before birth, although the data are, there's contrasting data, so I wouldn't swear on that, but certainly from early on, you get this difference in physical activity. And then the content of play really start to differentiate. For example, the biggest difference is in girls, you have this more play that has to do with social relations, also family relations. There's play parenting is, of course, a big thing, but it's not just that. It's also kind of called social dramatic play, where you're playing and simulating social relations of sorts. And well, my daughter now is doing a lot of that. She's 2, and one thing she does kind of, very funny, is that whenever there are objects and there's like more than 2 objects, she starts making a family out of it. This is mommy's baby, and she just does it with pretty much anything that she sees. So this idea of projecting these family relations and social relations, this is something you see more in girls than in boys. And in boys, you have, of course, play fighting, so rough and tumble, but there's all sorts of fighting. There's more object-oriented play, so playing with objects. Specifically, and especially things, when you're young children, things that can be, say, pushed and rolled, and also one thing that I think is kind of, nice when you raise, it's a nice point when you raise it. Joyce Benenson in her book really pointed this out. It's not just about fighting in the sense of playing, fighting one-on-one, but one really big theme in boys' play is fighting against an enemy. And the moment you realize, like, no, of course, I mean, it's everywhere. And that she links that to the fact that in humans you have coalitional aggression, right? Especially in males. So you have, war and fighting, but it's not just one-on-one fighting. You have coalitions that fight against other coalition. And this theme of getting together to fight some enemy is a really big theme in boys' play. So those are the main things. And this pattern, you can see this already in the first months of life to some extent, and then it increases. Middle childhood is when it peaks. It's kind of the amount of time spent playing, let's say, family parenting play versus play fighting peaks in middle childhood, which is also, I mean, when you have this kind of spontaneous sex segregation. Girls want to play with girls, boys want to play with boys, and this really peaks in middle childhood sometimes, and then in adolescence. It changes in a number of ways, but this is kind of the big picture. There's some data on primates too, where you find similar patterns, in not too many studies, unfortunately, but there's some evidence that in monkeys too, like young monkeys, they, for example, male monkeys like to play more with things like balls and cars, things, for example, they can push around, and those are preferred by females. There's also, I mean, which is one thing that's interesting, and parents, I mean, will recognize this probably, is not just about the kind of toys children play with, but also how they play with the same toy. And one example would be anyways, again, I credit Joyce Benison, the kind of the cutest example was a boy playing, a girl playing with cars, and she was putting the cars to sleep, right?
Yeah.
And again, this is not black or white. I mean, there's lots of overlap, and it's not like, girls don't like physical play or object play, but there's pretty robust differences there. And in monkeys, one thing is you see, for example, playing with sticks. There's one pattern where female monkeys will carry sticks like babies. Okay, they do some kind of, they seem to be practicing some kind of caregiving behaviors while the males do whatever, throw the sticks around. And also these patterns of toy preferences, which is a hot topic, kind of a persistent hot topic, but these differences, not just you see them to some extent in other primates, but they emerge pretty early in development. Certainly by the first year of life, this pattern is pretty well established of toy preferences, and some studies suggest that it could be even, just a few months of life. Of course, I mean, this is probably building on some kind of feedback processes. I mean, if boys, for example, have this just higher predisposition to be physically active, toys that kind of can be used in a more physically active way would be appealing. So, I mean, it's not to say that there's kind of hardwired preferences for cars or anything like that. There's been some of the criticisms, especially of the monkey studies, which seem a bit preposterous. Like, how do monkeys like cars, right? What's the meaning of that? And the point is not about a car, but the fact that cars allow certain kinds of play that may be more appealing or more fun for males. So yeah, this is the big picture. And then I have, I have to say that just because when you talk about toy preferences, there's of course, there's one related thing, which is the pink versus blue debate. And I'm just mentioning it because I think I'm one of the few people really who has written about this. And of course, the general idea is that pink and blue are just the materialization of gender stereotypes, a completely arbitrary thing that comes to define one sex and the other. And of course, completely arbitrary, and common wisdom is that it used to be the reverse. So until World War II, pink was for boys and blue was for girls, and then it switched somehow. And then turns out the evidence is not really like that. It's a bit of more stable pattern historically, and there are bits and pieces of evidence that maybe there might be a little biological basis for preferences for different color hues in males and females. And I leave it at that. Turns out it's incredibly controversial, and I just think that it's fascinating, and it's something I would really like to see studied more. And people just brush it away because it's really being used as an example of completely arbitrary norms that some people interpret as biological. And I wouldn't say that pink and blue is like a strong biological preference, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were something, some kind of biases. And there's been a few hypotheses about that. Not a lot of evidence, but it's interesting. But if you think about toys and toys preferences, like in the modern world, you can't really separate that from pink and blue. So I thought I would at least mention it. But I've written a couple of short papers on that. Just invite people to pay more attention.
Yeah, I understand. So, and when you say that there are preferences for certain kinds of toys, isn't it the case that there have been studies where people really pick some babies that are, for example, just a couple of months old, 2, 3 months old, or something like that, and they put them in front of a set of toys, and then boys tend to pick toys like, for example, cars, as you mentioned, and girls tend to pick toys that are similar to babies or people or something like that.
Yeah, there's. I mean, and I think like 3 months, 2, 3 months is the earliest you can, run the studies and probably the areas where you find this kind of thing. And of course, the question is, why is that the case? Because the pattern is robust. Is it parents? Maybe, it could come about in a number of ways. It could be parents maybe giving toys preferentially to boys versus girls. Could be some kind of more subtle communication, in the sense maybe discouraging or being less enthusiastic when a child, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk maybe about socialization theories. So that's that's one way to think about it. And of course, when you see so the primate data kind of challenges, and also there's a few studies suggesting that prenatal hormones, so exposure to prenatal hormones, also predicts toy preferences later on. So there's probably something more, a bit deeper than just socialized preferences to that. And it does fit with, for example, the physical activity. This is something you find also in other animals, the sex difference. And of course, that would, at least begin to trigger a cascade that would probably lead to differentiation. There might be, but I suspect there's something more specific going on too, especially for the parenting and family-oriented play, and of course the aggression-related play, like play fighting and collective fighting and stuff like that. So for sure.
Yeah,
but you see those things pretty early on, and so if you try to explain this with socialization, you have to. Of course, there's going to be some loop that maybe reinforces that. Especially, we mentioned that in the last interview. Of course, within each sex, you have quite a bit of variability. So if you take individuals one by one, you will find variability in preferences and in activity and so forth. At the moment you start putting children, for example, in groups, the group dynamics will probably tend to reinforce some gender dynamics more than you would see at individual level. So that's that could be a factor. Probably more stronger than parenting influences. Some people have argued that, I think with some reasons, that the peer group could shape behaviors in children more strongly than what parents can do. And there's some evidence of that.
Yeah, and of course I think that another thing that people that come up with theories based on socialization miss also is that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that people do not socialize randomly. That is, they pay attention, or they are sort of wired, let's say, to pay attention to certain specific cues and to certain people and things like that, correct?
Right. That's that's one of the big problems of the socialization accounts. But we can really probably talk about this later. But yeah, it's there's a chicken and egg. There's a big chicken and egg problem with socialization accounts.
Yeah.
yeah. I was going to say something, but I forgot.
Well, maybe we can move on to the next topic, and then later on, when we pick up again on theories of sex differences, maybe it will come back to your mind.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
no, I was going to mention that the cross, I mean, play, that's been, whenever there are children around, you see them playing. So, for example, there's quite a bit of data on playing from anthropologists and comparative data, also in hunter-gatherer societies, and those patterns, and also the age trend, like this peak in gender kind of segregation and fight versus parenting play in middle childhood. I mean, this is pretty robust cross-culturally too. So this is one of those patterns where if you have a socialization account, you really have to work hard to make sense of why pretty much in every culture you see the same pattern at the same age. When you try to measure parental effects on toy preferences, maybe you find, it's not that you don't find anything, but it's debatable where the effects you find are strong enough to account for the pattern, right? And when you see effects in the peer group, again, there's a little chicken and egg problem, because of course the peer group will tend to reinforce some norms and maybe change behaviors of children too. But where does that come from? But we can talk about this later.
Yeah, and even probably about the reinforcement, it could simply be that if, for example, all boys have the same innate tendency, for example, to rough and tumble play, maybe that's why there's it seems that there's a reinforcement process going on there, because I mean they are all doing the same thing, but because they all have that let's say natural proclivity to do that. It could be also another possibility, I guess.
Right. I mean, yeah, I mean that's the chicken and egg thing,
Yeah,
where does it come from?
yeah.
And but the point, I guess, is that you don't want to deny that social reinforcement plays a role. And personally, I suspect that it plays a bigger role again in group level dynamics than in individual development. But that's
Yeah. So we will come back to this later on, certainly. So, okay. So last time we talked about personality and some of the major differences that we've already studied across many societies across the world. And what about how it applies, how these personality differences apply to educational and occupational choices? Because I remember that, for example, I read a report from the Norwegian government a couple of years ago or so. I think it was back from 2014, where they released the report regarding the distribution of men and women in different educational and occupational professional positions, and even there in the Nordic countries. I mean, there's an interesting thing that it seems that as we move from less gender equal societies to more gender equal societies, there are at least a few occupations that women and men tend to prefer and cluster around them. Like, for example, there are more than 80% of nurses in Norway are female, and more than 90% of construction workers are male, and we could pick up other examples, but there's that sort of thing, right?
Right. And that's being called actually, you find to some extent even occupational differences that become sharper actually in countries that score higher on gender equality. And this is being called the gender equality paradox. In David Geary and others, they've work on it. So personality. There's there's a lot of research on this, of course, and on factors that could explain sex differences in occupational preferences. Again, I want to try to keep it short because it could be an interview by itself, right?
Yeah.
If you look at personality traits per se, it's probably not the most informative level. So if you look at things like, again, agreeableness, neuroticism, extroversion, I mean, they're going to, of course, feed into these preferences a bit, but there are some dimensions that are actually a bit more specific. So for example, a lot of people have studied the things versus people dimension. So preferences for activity, it's not just about jobs, but activities really that have to do with dealing with other people, right? Which includes, of course, care professions as a kind of subset of this. But there's other things, including sales, and other, all sorts of profession have a people component, and then there's more things component where you don't primarily deal with people, but with things or concepts or truck drivers would be one example of one kind of things oriented, and then you have things like, again, whatever, engineering, mathematics, in which you're not dealing with like physical things, but it's not primarily about social interactions. It's about something about
just to make a quick comment, you're also alluding to the work by Simon Baron Cohen about the empathizers versus the systematizers, right?
Sure. Which is these empathizing, systemizing differences, which again you find it, is a robust pattern, cross-cultural. So that's very robust. But it's not exactly the same thing, these people versus things, but they obviously correlated. And the people versus things really comes from research on vocational preferences. It's more specialized kind of thing. But then again, that is very robust. It's also cross-culturally pretty stable. And interesting enough, there was at least one study where they tracked, because of course, I mean, the actual participation in different professions has changed quite dramatically over the last maybe say 50 years, right? From the 60s or 70s. There's been quite a bit of change. But if you look at the preferences, there hasn't been a lot of change. So preferences for people versus things have been quite stable for decades. Small changes there, even as the professions, the representation in profession has changed to some extent. And then there's one level that's a bit more subtle, because when you look at professional, let's say educational and professional choices, you can look at very broad categories like, say, psychology versus engineering. But if you look inside these broad categories, there's going to be dimensions of more things-oriented versus people-oriented subdisciplines and specific jobs within those broad categories too. So, for example, in psychology, you can go, I guess clinical and developmental psychology tend to be, pretty strongly female biased, and they do deal with people in a more strong way. And then you can go to biological psychologies where you're I know, just dealing with hormones and neurotransmitters and kind of lab that you would expect, for example, not as strong a female bias in that subfield. So even within subfield, you find this differentiation. So it probably helps you see, because if you just concentrate on like very broad categories, it seems that you see what I mean. So some patterns, actually become a bit more interpretable when you look at narrower categories. So personality, of course, the things versus people, it does fit to some extent with the, if you think about the circumplex, right? Mm-hmm. This nurturance, dominance, and especially for care professions like nursing, it could be, medical, all sorts of medical jobs, psychotherapy. You find, very strong preference that's female biased, and more women tend to go in those professions. And that does fit with broad differences in, say, agreeableness, probably some other broad personality differences that go into that. But yeah, I would say that, go back to your point, personality probably helps explain some of the patterns. There are some more specific dimensions of differences that are also more explanatory. They combine with some cognitive differences, because of for same IQ, let's say same level of general intelligence, you do have a tilt what's called a tilt, where males tend to be more, on average again, have more visual spatial abilities than verbal for the same level of intelligence, and verbal abilities are more developed in females. So that contributes too. So there's preference for the kind of job and the amount of social interaction or social focus in the job. There are some cognitive differences that don't really have to do with like general level of intelligence, but the specifics of what you're good at in terms of visual spatial processing versus verbal, which is, again, verbal is actually a slightly broader category, so it includes some kinds of reasoning too. And then I guess that, and of course, I mean, there are some preferences that are, again, linked to personality, that have to do, for example, a drive for status and income as motivators. And again, works for both sexes, but generally speaking, men tend to be more strongly motivated by higher income and higher status. While if you ask women, you will find pretty robust that women, like that, but they try to balance it out with, for example, having more time for family and social relationships, and work-life balance is not as strong and as you find in men. And so, of course, that also will influence the choice of professions, especially, I guess, when you look at a finer scale. So specific jobs within broad categories. There will be some jobs that are, more have larger payoff in terms of, say, income, and they have social costs. Because, for example, you have to travel a lot, or you don't have time for relationships and things like that. And those you can expect more men will tend to go in there than women. So that's the big picture. One interesting question is, are those differences enough to explain the distribution of men and women in different, say, educational pathways and professions? And that's actually a very hard question to answer. And it's kind of surprising because we've been researching this for a long time, but still, it's hard to say whether those differences in predispositions and preferences are enough, strong enough to explain the pattern, or, how much room you're leaving essentially for things like, active discrimination on the job, or other kinds of selection that are, more obviously unfair because not based on people's preferences. And that's the big debate. If you attribute 100% of the differences to discrimination, that doesn't make sense, because preferences are pretty strong, they're pretty stable over time, and people will tend to sort themselves out in different ways. The question is, does that then, case closed, does that account for the patterns we see? Or maybe it accounts for 30% of the pattern, and the remaining 70% is discrimination. That's we want to know. Unfortunately, it's hard to study for a number of methodological reasons, and also not a lot of people want to study it in this way. So I would say, just before we finish on this topic, there's, one thing is because of course when people are talking about this topic, there's actually two questions that are intermingled, and one is the choice of, say, type of occupation, right? And the other problem is to some extent, like success within an occupation. So who gets to the top of a profession, or gets, higher earning brackets in a certain, and that there again, you would expect some differences to play a role. Actually, I would expect personality differences to maybe play a bigger role there to some extent. We talked last time, there's a, not huge, but pretty stable sex difference in risk-taking.
Yeah.
To the extent, that can play a role in, for example, making professional choices that could reward you a lot, but also be very risky and have lots of, high chance of failure. And to the extent that more men tend to make high-risk decisions in their professional lives, you will also expect more men to, end up in the, in the good and in the bad outcomes of the risk-taking. There's also, and then again, very briefly, but for cognitive abilities, there's also some tail effects, right? If you find more men in the very high end and in very low end of the distribution, that's going to be, especially for professions or jobs that are very selective, that's also going to fit into that. So when you look at the outcome, so distribution of jobs, profession, income between men and women, you have it's not a one factor story. There's many factors that fit into that, and how they combine will depend a lot on the specific kinds of job, the social constraints, of course. I mean, if there are constraints or deliberate biases in what men and women can do, of course, I mean, that will play into that too. But also, it depends if you're looking at broad categories, narrow categories, or you're looking at like average income, say, or like top bracket income. That's going to make a difference. So you really there's no simple story there, and a bunch of factors that are going to, contribute to explain things. Of course, again, the risk taking, it depends where you want to stop your explanation. So, for example, if you take like a very proximate perspective, you can measure, say, preferences and personality traits and try to explain job outcomes with that. If you take, for example, an evolutionary perspective, you might, for example, when you see, well, men tend to prefer higher status and higher income occupation, means stronger motivation for income and status, and risk-taking too. Well, why is that the case? And then, of course, mating preferences are probably going to explain quite a bit of that, because status and income are stronger assets for men in terms of attractiveness than for women. So mating markets to some extent explain why men and women have certain preferences, and that feeds into the professional choices they make. So there's an interesting story to be told if you don't stop exactly at the level of, okay, there's trait X and outcome Y, and let's figure out if we can explain Y with X.
Yeah, and since we mentioned the gender equality paradox, do you think that the best explanation that we have for it at the moment is that in countries like the more developed ones, since people have more opportunities, that they have more freedom to follow their innate proclivities, that is, to choose educational and professional occupations that go in line with their personality traits and with some of the main differences between men and women, and that would explain why in countries like the Nordish countries in Europe, like Sweden, Norway, and so Denmark, and so on and so forth, those are the ones where we find the most extreme distributions, at least in terms of certain occupations.
I mean, that's very reasonable, and I think there's some evidence for it. Let's say, I'm not sure this is a complete explanation.
Yeah.
I can't think of a better explanation at the moment. So I would say it makes sense in a number of ways. I wouldn't bet that this is all there is. There might be other things that are going on, because and the reason is it's not just gender. Well, there's gender equality tends to be correlated, for example, with better economic conditions. That's one thing. So people might be more free, less constrained. There's also, it tends to be correlated with a pretty heavy welfare state. Does that affect people's choices in terms of, for example, the amount, the risk tolerance that people have? Or I don't know. So there might be details to add to this account, although I find it convincing enough, and I don't have a better theory. So, but I probably there's probably more to discover about that. One problem with testing theories, and there's been some debate about this gender equality paradox, because David Geary and others have published a paper. There were commentaries. This happened very recently. There's been quite a bit of debate about analyzing data in different ways. One of the problems you have with these kind of cross-country comparisons is you don't have many countries. You can't. So your sample size is going to be very limited. You can't say, okay, let's run a bigger study and have 1,000 countries instead of 100. Well, there aren't many countries. So you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And you probably look at smaller, finer scale, but there are limits to what you can do, especially when you try to test explanatory hypotheses instead of just looking at patterns, it becomes actually pretty tricky to do for cross-cultural data because just the number of places and countries and cultures is, there's not that many of those. So.
Yeah, yeah, and last time, for example, we talked about univariate versus multivariate analysis, and I guess that in this case, we shouldn't expect that one single factor will explain these differences, right?
Right, that's what I mean. But the problem is, usually when you want to test, let's say we make a more complex model that instead of having 2-3 variables, there's maybe 5 different, 10 different variables interacting in specific way. Okay, usually to test this kind of model, you actually need large samples, which is exactly what we don't have when we look at across countries. So it just becomes trickier to test more sophisticated models. While for individual data, to some extent you can afford more complex models if you run larger studies. For cultural differences, you just can't do it. Or you have to find other tricks, like, again, looking at the longitudinal data, or look at sub-regions, say, take the United States. Instead of looking at the US as a whole, you can look at individual states or regions. But, again, it gets also tricky for other reasons, too. So I guess the debate, which is kind of good to keep the debate going, and also the countries are what they are. It's not like you can run a study with, okay, we've studied Finland and Sweden and this that. Okay, let's now study a different sample of countries. No, these are the countries you have. So there's just very strong limits to what you can say about cross-cultural differences, which I think it really helps if you can link your theories to kind of strong theoretical background. This is where I think this goes eventually. But yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, so just before we get into another section of our discussion today, I guess that it's important for us to mention here that we are talking or focusing more on differences, in this case between men and women, but studying men and women, I mean, by doing that, we also study in what ways they are similar, because men and women are more similar than they are different from one another, right? I mean, it's certainly not the case that the picture we're trying to paint here is something like along the lines of men being from Mars and women from Venus, like if they were two completely different species, right?
No. Again, yeah, I mean that. Thanks for going right to the core of the question. Yeah, I mean, you want to, okay, let's give so a general feeling is that, yeah, sure. I mean, you want to account for similarities and you want to account for differences and you want to make sense of it. That's the other thing, which is what I don't find very productive. And I really don't even, some people might think I do because I've published, we talked about last time about, factors that, depending on how you measure differences and how you, for example, aggregate differences, they can go from pretty small to pretty large. Yep. And I've made an argument for larger differences in personality. But what I really don't find interesting is this competition between similarity and difference. It's like, oh no, men and women are more different. No, they're more similar. Like, A, it depends on how you measure things. B, it depends on the traits. There's some traits or domains where similarities are, it's a good description, it's more similar than different, however you quantify that. In other domains, you have very sharp differences. What are you interested in? Are you interested in the kind of general patterns? Are you interested in like what happens at extreme places in the distribution? So everything depends. So what I really don't find productive is this framing as a battle between men and women are different, men and women are similar. What I would really like to have is a story right? An account that actually tells you why you find similarities in some areas and differences in others, and why, for example, different contexts, also, context and variables and whatnot, they can change the size and manifestations of differences. So ideally, you want a model that tells you about reality. So okay, after this, sorry for a little rant, but
No.
the problem is this is kind of a chronic problem in psychology. And okay, let me tell you, so there's one little historical note that I want to make, which is, especially if you read me, I've read this over and over, about this idea people have that until maybe the 60s or something like that, psychologists were convinced that you have these massive differences between men and women. You have this very traditional kind of roles and so forth. And then it changed, and we discovered that actually differences are small, and there's more similarity than differences, and so on. And actually, I think it's kind of instructive to go and look at what was going on in psychology, for example, in the 100 years ago, the early 20th century. And it turns out, so clinical psychology is a bit different. But if you look at academic psychology, the truth is that it's a very long-standing emphasis on similarity, and really goes back to the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. So the first book that I'm aware of that looks at sex differences using like laboratory tasks and standardized questionnaires, that kind of thing, is from 1903, and it was written by a woman. She's Helen Woolley Thompson. So kind of that, I think, kind of shatters a lot of kind of received notions about the history of psychology. So we have a book doing this kind of first systematic investigation of sex differences in a kind of more formal, laboratory-based setting. And this is from 1903, written by a woman who was actually the head of a psychology department, I think, and the conclusion was that for most traits, similarities outweigh differences. And if you read, summaries of research in the 1910s and 1920s, you will find again this emphasis on similarities. And you find another theme that's kind of, a constant, which is psychologists reviewing the research, coming to the conclusion that for most traits, similarities are probably stronger than differences, and wondering why lay people continue to have these gender stereotypes. Which is, why do people keep believing that men and women are so different when we can show that they are so similar? So this theme is nothing new in psychology. This has been going on for a century, right? And it follows probably ebbs and flows a little bit depending on the broader social context. So of course, in the 1910s and 20s, you had big, strong first wave feminism, and a lot of authors and psychologists were influenced by that. Then in the 70s, you have the second wave feminism, and where probably the critical point in the 70s is a book by Maccabee and Jacqueline. It's probably you heard of it. Yeah, it's famous, super famous book, reviewing the evidence for sex differences. And the conclusion they came to is that there's basically three robust sex differences, which is aggression, visual, spatial, mathematical abilities, and verbal abilities. And that's it. That's all. These are the three robust. And again, they wonder in this book, why do people keep believing that men and women are different in all these personality traits and social behaviors when they're not? So actually, this book is, okay, I have to, but because it's become iconic, and it's been really cited very uncritically. There's been some criticism of the Maccabee and Jacqueline book from '74, almost right after publication, and it's not a great book in terms of the selection of studies and the analysis. It's not very well argued. There's all sorts of methodological criticism, but then it's kind of remained in the collective imagination of psychologists as the book that showed that sex differences are very limited. There's only very narrow things, and all the rest is basically similarity. And then, of course, in the 2005, you have the famous paper by Janet Hyde, where they formulated this gender similarities hypothesis. And the hypothesis, again, this first thing is men and women are more similar than different. which is kind of, okay, what does that mean? And what they did was to actually offer some quantitative benchmarks. They chose some measures of effect size where they would argue that below that is similarity, and above that you can speak of some kind of sizable differences, which I think is it's not a great idea, because we don't want to talk about this now, but the same size of a difference can mean a lot in certain contexts and not in other contexts. You can have a certain difference between men and women on average, and that can make a big difference in the distribution of some outcomes. But for example, be useless if you're trying to classify men and women in different groups for whatever purpose. So it's very context dependent. But anyway, so I see maybe three main waves in the history of psychology, but I think the consensus position has been more often than not that similarities dominate the picture, that differences are really kind of narrow and localized, and psychologists have been wondering why the public keep believing in sex differences when we can show they're not that big. So that's been a kind of long-standing theme in psychology. It's not a new thing. And part of my answer would be, well, first, we talked about that last time, but there are issues of measurement, of aggregation. Sometimes, you don't seem to find large and robust differences because you're looking either at the wrong level of analysis, or you're failing to aggregate those things into meaningful patterns. Again, at the same time, depending where you look and what context you're interested in, you might not find big differences in a lot of behaviors. So that's true, which is also interesting in its own respect, right? Yeah, I don't know where you want to go with this question, but let's say if you look at general average distributions and overlap, that gives you one kind of picture. And for many traits, you don't have a huge difference there. And if you let's look at it, let's say in an average workplace, and you're looking at aggression, you're not going to see a whole lot of, it's not like men go around and being punching each other. And so even if there are differences in, say, physical and verbal aggression, in contexts where this is not salient, you're not going to get huge differences. You will see more uniformity. It changes a bit if you get into a context where, say, aggression and violence are very salient. So let's say there's at some point there's a riot or a fight. Then you will see very stark sex differences. Or let's say if you look at things like, okay, homicide rates. Who commits homicide, men or women? And there you find huge differences. It's like cross-culturally. I don't remember the numbers exactly, but it's about 90, let's say 90-something% of homicides are committed by men. And this is very cross-culturally stable. It's not localized to any particular place. And part of the reason is, again, homicide is a complicated thing, but you're really looking more at extremes of aggression and extremes of some kinds of behaviors. And there the differences can become incredibly sharp. Even if you were just looking, see what I mean? So the similarities is not just a matter of stable differences. There's also some contextual effect that can be quite important. And so behaviors where you don't see big differences in, say, a safe day-to-day, kind of protected environment may actually become exaggerated once you move to a different kind of context, which is also, and then, I'm repeating myself, but that's, I think, which again leads me to say it's not really a matter of deciding whether men and women are more similar or different in general. It's really about understanding why and when and at what conditions you see the differences, and when you don't. By the way, we're going to talk, just before I forget, about evolutionary explanations for sex differences. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sexual selection models, which, for example, mate competition and mate choice can produce pretty stark differences. Mm-hmm. At the same time, mate choice can also produce similarities. There are some mechanisms. So when the choice is reciprocal, for example. And this usually happens when you have like shared parenting, which humans, do to some extent. Then sexual selection can actually select for more similarity. Or when for some cognitive traits, has been the argument. Jeffrey Miller argued that when you have sexual displays that are, for example, he's made the argument that like creative, artistic displays, they have been there's been sexual selection on the cognitive abilities that allowed you to be creative and whatever, interesting and smart and whatever. But of course, whatever sex is more selected for, the other sex is selected to judge the quality of the displays. And so even in a kind of classic sexual selection scenario, the process might be selecting for some similar traits into sexes. So this is just a note, and we're going to be back there. Now I'm not going to forget, but I was a bit worried that usually you hear people mentioning sexual selection as a force of as kind of disruptive force in the sense that it tends to separate males and females, but actually there are conditions in which sexual selection can bring males and females closer together. And that really depends on the mating system and other things. So again, a good theory of sex differences should be able to explain both the similarities and the differences without really explaining any of them away. You're right that, there's a danger. Of course there's danger. If you focus on differences, especially if you want to, let's take the idea of a standard narrative. If you open a textbook, like psychology textbook, more often than not, the narrative is that sex differences are, localized. People will still be citing Maccabee and Jacqueline, probably. There's, a few domains where you have differences, but overall, similarity dominates. So, of course, if you're arguing for differences, you're, antagonizing this point of view a little bit. So, of course, the risk is that you get into a rigid perspective of, exaggerating the differences or making, more stark than they are. So that's a risk, and I totally agree with that. I think the antidote, though, is not polarization in the sense of dueling sides in which no, they're more similar, no, they're more different. The only antidote to that is a good theory that will account for the similarities and the differences and the context that tend to bring out the differences or suppress them.
Mm-hmm. I understand. And now, talking about gender stereotypes, until very recently, particularly in social psychology, people thought that stereotypes were always negative, or at least over generalizations about people's behavior. Stereotypes about the sexes, about different races, about different ethnic groups, and so on and so forth. But now people are questioning that, and they are really collecting data that says that, or that say that at least many times the stereotypes coincide with reality. That the ideas that people have about a particular group of people are at least somewhat true, sometimes completely true. So in the case of sex differences, do you know if people's basic intuitions about how men and women are expected to behave, or how they behave, are right or not?
All right. That's general story, right? Is that, and this is a big kind of revolution in social psychology, this stereotype accuracy. So by and large, there are refinements there, but by and large, stereotypes tend to be more accurate than not. And if you look at, there's a lot of research on gender stereotypes. So by and large, they match the self-reports. So that's the thing. So you want to compare how males and females are perceived with how males and females, for example, describe themselves. Or the kind of, for specific behaviors, you can actually look at some kind of objective measures in the world, but that's how you do it. Sort of compare the stereotype in the sense that it's the perception of how groups differ. And for men and women, I would say by and large they match. So people are, again, individually, people can be more or less extreme, more or less accurate. So that's, again, within, it's not like everybody has accurate stereotypes. That's the other thing. So this is an average trend. So if you take say people's average perception of how male and females are different, they match reality by and large. However, so individual people can be quite a bit off. So they might be exaggerating the stereotypes. They might be, more or less accurate. They may be, perceiving similarities where there are differences. So everything can happen. So these are average patterns. So it's not like, which I think confuses the debate a little bit, because, on average, stereotypes are accurate. Doesn't mean that, let's say, your specific stereotypes are necessarily accurate. That's the thing. And of course, people have different experiences. They absorb different kind of cultural, lenses to interpret realities. Of course, they will differ a little bit. I think there's a few things to. Well, one thing is stereotype accuracy is definitely a thing. Have you interviewed Lee Jussim?
Yeah. Yes, I've interviewed him. Yeah.
Right. So, all right, we don't have to cover that anymore. But there are, so for sex differences, I mean, there are also exceptions, and there are actually some areas where a lot of people, and then again, that might vary a little bit with education, and so, different social niches have different views of stereotypes. So if you ask, about men and women to whatever, people with PhDs or psychology students, they're going to have slightly different views than, say, whatever, less educated people or other populations, depending, and they might be more or less accurate. But there are some exceptions that at least I find a lot of the times. For example, one that's kind of funny is about pain tolerance. Who's better able to withstand pain? Is it men or women? And when I ask, I used to present more on sex differences, and I always ask this question to the audience. And 90%, 99% is that women are better at dealing with pain than men are. That's the stereotype. At least, again, I'm not sure this applies to the whole population, but at least people who come to my talks, there's a very strong stereotype that men are better at withstanding pain than men. It turns out there's been research on this for, hundreds of studies for a century, and it's exactly the opposite. So any kind of pain stimulations, also you can try all sorts of combinations, but in fact pain thresholds are higher for men than for women, and men are better at tolerating pain than women are across the board. That's an interesting exception, which it's interesting the way that it goes. So it's not like stereotypes have to be necessarily accurate. And of course, there are probably reasons for this particular kind of counter stereotype, if you want. And why, and in a way, if you think of think biologically and think of the activities that men are more involved with, historically and throughout evolution, including, fighting, hunting, whatever, you would expect, these are high risk physical activities. You would expect more tolerance of pain. And this is exactly what you find.
By the way, when you mention pain, you're only including physical pain, strictly physical pain, or also emotional pain?
I'm this thing I'm actually talking about physical pain.
Okay.
And people use all sorts of, you can, how do you say, like, there's various ways to study it, right? And you can say, use heat or cold or punctures, or everything's been done, and it's an incredibly consistent result. It's pretty large difference. Men are more tolerant to pain than women are. But if you ask people, they will tell you the opposite. And of course, this has to do with, childbirth. So I think what kind of confuses this is, of course, childbirth is extremely painful. This is, something that's female specific, and so I think that is the attractor that kind of switches things around. But it's kind of interesting, and I've seen one day I was reading a book that was years ago, I don't remember, but it was a psychologist. He was actually doing training in the military for soldiers, and he said that the soldiers were just amazed to learn that women actually tolerate pain much better than men. And I was reading this book, it's like, no, that's not true. Where do you get that from? That's a very powerful stereotype, kind of goes against the data and the research and kind of biological sensible story. That said, okay, there was kind of in a way a funny bit. and there, but this is also to say that you want to rightly emphasize that stereotypes by and large tend to be accurate, but you want to, develop this a little bit further. First thing, they're not always accurate. There are islands, exceptions, and then individual people stereotypes may not be accurate. And of course, uh, there is a risk that even generalizations that are based in reality, they become too, rigid and too kind of clear cut, and they blind you to variation and they blind you to reality in a way. So it's not, I'm not kind of, I don't want to uncritically promote gender stereotypes as a representation of reality. And on the other hand, just assuming that stereotypes are arbitrary, necessarily exaggerating differences, I mean, that's not true. None of this is true. There's been historically, I mean, this thing people have been studying for quite a bit. So it's interesting to look at how stereotypes of males and females have actually changed over time. That's also, interesting. There's been, I think there's been like 3 big meta-analyses spanning like 30 to 70 years. So we have quite a bit of data, and by and large, not a lot of change. That's the big picture is, especially, so since the 80s, one study that looked from the 80s to like mid 2020s, basically no change in major stereotypes. If you look at longer time, you have ups and downs. So there's been kind of a trend toward more egalitarian kind of views, maybe between the 70s and 90s, and then it goes down a little bit. So it oscillates a little bit. It's not a completely flat line, but by and large, you don't see any major. I think the one exception that you really see is about perception of competence. Mm-hmm. And there you really have an increasing trend in which women are seen as more competent than men on average. It has been increasing and possibly reversing also over maybe, I don't know, could be like 70 years or something like that. That's a real change. For things like personality, people have looked a lot of things like agency and communion, so using the interpersonal circumflex as a framework. You see, little changes over there. They're not necessarily in the direction of stereotypes becoming weaker. Sometimes they become a bit stronger over time. And again, there's ups and downs, but it's I think it's kind of striking that the big picture is not a picture of massive change. It's more of a picture of oscillations and ups and downs, but it's more static than dynamic, I would say. Which, matches. So, for example, it does match people's self-reports. And it does also match the self-reports, not just about personality, but other things that, people versus things, interest and stuff like that. So those have been stable too, which is kind of interesting because as, to some extent, actual, social outcomes may actually change more. Mm-hmm. The preferences and the stereotypes tend to be more static, which suggests to some extent that some of the changes that you see in societies might be more patterned inside than it looks from an angle. And I mentioned, earlier for example, more women going into certain professions. There's been a definite social change. It would be interesting to see exactly the distribution within the profession and how maybe the profession has changed as a result. Because professions are also not something that's completely static. What happens, what doctors do, it's not just a fixed thing for eternity. So again, you can imagine that as more, for example, say women go into a certain kind of profession, you would expect, if you have an eye to the stability of, say, personality differences and cognitive differences and stereotypes, you would actually expect that professions will change to some extent, because now you have different, people going into them, and people have been tracking this a little bit, and you find effects like that. Mm-hmm. So, it's just, again, a more interesting picture than just saying, just because it makes you wonder. So if you look at all the social changes in the last maybe say 70 years, and then you look at the data of stereotypes, it's just so striking that the stereotypes are, have changed so little relative to the social changes that you had. So you can either be, amazed and like, there's something wrong with the stereotypes, or maybe we need to, I don't know, educate people even more about, counter the stereotypes even more energetically. You can take this information in a number of different ways. Again, I always advocate for trying to make sense of it in a way that's, sophisticated and not just as a battleground between extreme views.
Yeah. So, and about the topic of sex and gender, because, I mean, do you think that it makes sense from an evolutionary slash biological perspective to differentiate between two different entities here, one being sex and the other gender? Because there are many, I don't know if they are many or not, but there are some disciplines where people, when they refer to sex, they are talking about physical traits, purely physical traits, not the psychological ones. And when they refer to gender, they are talking more about behavior, about and other psychological traits that people have, like emotions and things like that. And that happens a lot, for example, in gender studies, women's studies, in sociology, in certain branches of anthropology, and even psychology. And we've already talked about, for example, Ellis here, and probably we will touch also on the exchange that occurred between you and David Schmidt and Cordelia Fine, Gina Rippon, and other people. And for them, gender is basically something that, if it's not completely separated from the rest of our phenotype, it's pretty close to that. That is, they think that it is completely culturally or socially constructed, and biology has little to nothing to do with the psychological aspects of men and women. So do you think that it makes sense to talk about two different things here?
I mean, okay, that's a funny topic. So it's a big mess, the terminology here. And well, to some extent, I mean, the reason is that the terminology has been driven by, not just by like, let's say, so the goal of introducing new terminology or changing the terminology mixes, describing reality and actually making some points that are more ideological. That's been from the start. So, and people have actually tracked, the rise of gender as a term in science, and it really starts in the 50s. It gets really, really popular in the 70s, again pushed by feminist authors. And at the time, the implication is very, very strong that you want to differentiate sex and maybe some, physical, like whatever, sexual characters like breasts versus genitals, and from the behavior and psychology and expectations and roles, okay? And you want to use gender for that. However, you're making the pretty explicit assumption that those things are not the result of biology, but they're socialized. Mm-hmm. So the distinction between sex and gender, how it emerges in the 70s, is really conflating. On the one hand, is separating, let's say, physical traits from psychological traits. But it's also making a statement that the physical traits are biological and the behavioral traits are socialized.
By the way, let me just ask you one thing there. Since you mentioned the 50s and then the 70s, are you talking about people that were psychologists that introduced that distinction, or are you referring mostly or also to some philosophers like, for example, Simone de Beauvoir and Michel Foucault and people like that?
Well, I mean, no. I don't know if philosophy has been the main driver, really. I mean, you see the social sciences. This is where these terms really became popular. So, it's been, sociology. Sociology is probably stronger influence at the beginning, but psychology too. If you read, like, papers from 70s, in psychology, you will see a lot of talk of gender. And it's pretty explicitly used to mark this differentiation between, kind of brute biological facts and the facts of behavior and society and roles, which are, the results of a socialization process. So these are the social sciences and things. That's where this thing really became popular. And then something funny happens, which is as people start to use gender more instead of sex, especially in some disciplines, people start kind of using these as synonyms. Mm-hmm. This kind of so it starts with a very differentiated meaning that conflates, physical and biological versus behavioral and socialized. And then in some disciplines kind of become mixed up in a very randomly. And I think David Haig has tracked the use of these terms over time. And one of the reasons probably people just started to use gender for things like, I don't know, rats and animal studies, and you start using gender instead of sex, is because it sounds more polite. Like sex, because of course sex has implications about like sexual acts and stuff. Gender seems like a more scientific sounding and neutral. So in some areas, they become pretty much a way to. So people use gender to mean biological sex. In some areas, people use gender to mean not the biological sex, everything else, with the implication that it's actually socially constructed to some extent. And then, of course, the problem is that over time, the problem with using these labels as originally intended is, of course, you're making very strong assumption that behaviors and social roles are actually socially constructed and don't have a biological influence. So, and then you have all the research on, say, the androgens and all the biological research. So at some point, it becomes a bit untenable. This idea that gender is, which of course a lot of people subscribe to, but the idea that gender in the sense of sex-related behaviors, they are not biological, whatever. That becomes really hard to maintain, and so everything becomes muddled. Right, and people start using these terms in very inconsistent ways. Sometimes there's a strong implication of socialization versus biology. Sometimes there isn't. Then you see people talking about clearly stuff that is really gonadal sex or chromosomal sex and calling it gender. It becomes a really big mess. And so now there's been a tendency of the last maybe 10, 20 years of in feminist scientists and philosophers to try to undo the mess, right? Because now we have a separation between sex and gender. Everyone thinks they know what they're talking about, but they don't. When people say, "Oh no, this is not sex, this is gender," then you ask, "Okay, why? We're saying that?" And either there's some kind of vague implication, or there's actually a statement that's probably wrong. So, and one way to undo this has been to just put them together and talk about, say, gender sex or sex gender, like have a single word for both. And my problem with that attempt, so on the one hand, they would seem, okay, let's try to undo the mess, because there is a bit of a terminological mess. The problem with going this way is that, of course, biological sex. And this is, we can, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but we can go there if you want. Biological sex in terms of males versus females is actually a binary distinction. Where and it is based biologically on the type of gamete. So you have, egg versus sperm, nothing in between. So, as someone has, it's kind of this meme going around, sex is as binary as it gets. So you do have, again, intersex. You can define that pretty precisely, and it's, you have a few very low frequency cases, but overall the dynamics of the evolution of sex, it really drives a wedge between the the gametes and creates a true biological binary. So that's the kind of the essence of biological sex is the binary. But then the phenotypes that are associated with sex, including the physical traits and the behavioral traits, they have variation and they overlap. Whether you want to call them like a spectrum or not depends a little bit on what you think a spectrum is. But there's definitely, so while sex as a biological phenomenon is a binary thing, the traits associated with sex, they're not. They have variation and overlap. And one problem though is that now you have some people pushing for this gender sex label in which you're now implying that biological sex and behaviors and social roles, they're not sharply distinct. There's an intermingling of biology and culture and socialization, which is fine. But now you're also starting to imply that biological sex is also not a binary thing and is more like a spectrum and something that's fuzzy and dimensional and so forth. And that again is an implication that you really don't want to make. So it's still a big mess. And I would say, do we need a distinction between sex and gender? And I would actually, I think that you really need, and this is why people are keep using these terms. I think there's very good reasons to distinguish between the physical sex-linked traits. You want to distinguish between sex as a binary phenomenon that's based on reproduction. That's one thing. Then you have physical traits, and then you have psychological behavioral traits that are associated with sex. It's nice to, you don't want to use the same word for everything. That becomes, confusing. So it's nice to have different words. The problem is, what's the baggage? Because if we agree to define, say, gender as the behavioral and social traits that are associated with sex and themselves are, reflect some biological predispositions and some social influences, blah, blah, then I'm fine. The problem is if you're using gender and also making the implication that the behavioral traits are not biological. That's not warranted. So, and I don't know if you're ever going to get out of the terminology mess. It's kind of funny sometimes when you see people who, especially if you're aware of the history of these terms, sometimes, especially on the internet, sometimes you will see people just, just very confidently, like, they think they're going to settle the debate just by, explaining to people what is sex and what is gender, and that's so simple, right? Oh, you guys are all confused because you're talking about gender, you're calling sex, blah blah, and as if distinguishing between sex and gender is kind of a magic formula that resolves ambiguities, and actually you create probably more ambiguities and problems than you're solving. Anyways, to some extent, if you agree on what we're talking about, it's all fine. But it's interesting because a lot of the ambiguity and the confusion can be sometimes exploited on both sides to make ideological points or as kind of two weapons in ideological battles. And in this case, I think it's a very, very clear-cut case of words being. And this is nothing new. The very distinction between sex and gender was really introduced in the social sciences with the intention of making an ideological point to some extent. Mm-hmm. That behaviors and roles and social expectations are kind of arbitrary and socialized, and they're not brute facts of biology. So of course, from there, you try to navigate this landscape.
Yeah. At a certain point there, you made the point that I was about to make, but you did it first. But I guess it's important to re-emphasize here that, when we mention things like biological sex, we are sort of implying, or at least people who do so are sort of implying that there's something about the sexes or the genders that is not biological, but that doesn't make sense, right? Because even culture and how culture affects us and socialization, all of those things have a biological basis. So it's all biological at the end of the day, right?
You, of course, you can say that. You're using like a definition of what is biology that is sometimes not what people have in mind when they make a distinction between biology and culture, right? So, right, let's say if you have an appropriately sophisticated view of how biology works, then you can say something like that. Of course, if you're implying that biological traits are like whatever, fixed, hardwired, isolated from learning, and then that doesn't work. Then of course, you have a very narrow conception of what biology means. But yeah, and then you can probably find some traits that are more or less arbitrary. Maybe some differences. I don't know. I mean, yes and no, because I'm thinking hairstyles. So those are, I still think there's some factors in there that actually fit into broad patterns. But you have like fashion and things. You can actually find some things that are used as, say, markers of sex, and they are more or less arbitrary. Pink and blue colors would be a great candidate for it. Although even there, I suspect there might be something going on that has evolutionary roots. I mean, at least a little bit of it. But yeah, I mean, you can, and some traits are going to be very resistant to socialization. I mean that if you actually, this is one test. Let's say there's a sex difference between males and females, and you set out to change it. You actually try to change it, and some differences are very resistant. Even if you try, it's very hard to change it. And some differences may actually be malleable. Does that mean that they are not biological? Well, that again depends on what you mean by biological, because some biological mechanisms are flexible and evolved to be flexible and malleable, and some mechanisms evolved to be very rigid and robust. So that's also So yeah, in a way, if you define your terms well enough, I think you can actually make the case that you don't want a sharp separation between biology and, say, culture or learning, but it has to be a good model of biology, not a, because you can, of course, you can hypersimplify in both ways, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe we can pick up on one of the topics that you mentioned there to establish a bridge with the next topic, that is, we're going to talk a little bit about theories of sex differences, at least the main ones that are out there, and people on the more environmental side of things talk a lot about learning. But even learning, I mean, people don't learn random things. Babies and people come sort of prepared to pay attention to certain aspects in their environment, to pay attention to certain people and not others in different contexts, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it's not that people who espouse some sort of learning mechanism for people to acquire certain psychological traits are right when they say that people can learn anything, or that they pay attention to anything and anything goes. So, right.
Well, I mean, yeah. Okay, let's go for it. So you can document patterns of sex differences, debate whether they're large or small, and whether similarities outweigh, and you can track development over time. Of course, at some point you want to explain where these differences and similarities come from, and there's I guess the mainstream in psychology is probably some version of, let's call them whatever, socialization theory or social learning theories. And the idea, I mean, there's various flavors of it. What they do, I mean, the main thing is that behaviors and roles and expectations that are associated with sex, they are basically learned through some kind of socialization process, which, it's unclear what exactly socialization is, but you can think of things like, well, it could be direct kind of reinforcement learning. So, if parents, let's say, they're approving when girls play with dolls, and they're get angry or punishing, or when girls play with trucks or something like that. I mean, that could be just very direct process of reinforcement. And then, of course, you have more sophisticated things, like you have kind of role models. You can look, have kind of vicarious learning. You can look at the idea is that, for example, media, like films and books and TV and advertisement or whatever, they're all kind of giving you information about the expectations for males versus females, and people will respond to this in various ways. And so the general idea of socialization is, there's really, the roots of that are kind of behavioristic, but then you can, of course, try to build more detailed models of how, from a cognitive perspective, for example, children create, a set of schemas and expectations and things, how the developmental process goes, what are the factors, and that would be, for example, there's gender schema theory, which is still, it's still a socialization approach. It's really about the specific mechanisms, so trying to be more explicit about the specific cognitive mechanisms that mediate the acquisition of these behaviors. So yeah, that's the basic. You have, Bandura and Michel, and so you want, okay. There's there's research on it. Of course, there's a lot of research, but my assessment is that this approach in some ways is kind of feels like, every time I read and I try to update myself on what's going on in, say, socialization research, and the feeling at least I get is this approach is kind of stuck in the 70s forever. It's I don't think there's been really major advancements. Again, except gender schema theory tried to advance in the sense of becoming more explicit and incorporating ideas from cognitive science about what goes on in the mind of children as they develop these behaviors and expectations. But by and large, it's that's it. It's very blank slate kind of theory. The idea is that society, either in terms of your parents, your peers, or let's say media and schools and authority figures, whatever, they provide you with this package of expectations and behaviors, and in various ways children kind of absorb it and reinforce it, and so on. Now, the fact, okay, if you look at the evidence for it, here's where it becomes interesting, because you find it's not like there's no evidence for it. Mm-hmm. You find correlations and associations between, for example, say some behaviors in parents and behaviors in children. If you ask parents about their, say, gender stereotypes or beliefs about gender, you find some correlations with the way the children behave, and so forth. You can, there's some experimental work you can do in terms of, for example, toy preferences, and actually try to, change behavior, usually in the short term, and see if, to what extent. So there's evidence. And maybe, proponents of the approach would disagree, but, from, at least if you come from a more biological perspective, where you really have kind of a very strong narrative and a very strong account, and very strong effects too. The evidence in the socialization paradigm is, to me, is very piecemeal. So there's two features that kind of deflate a little bit. One is very piecemeal. You don't really find this grand account. So you have a theoretically a kind of grand account of learning and roles and schemas, but then in practice the evidence is really kind of narrow and piecemeal. You find bits of evidence and correlations here and there to kind of try to piece together. And the other thing is that many times these effects are not very strong. They're just not very strong. So remember, correlations between parents' belief about genders and children's behaviors, you find correlations, but they're not very strong correlations. And similarly, the effects when you're trying to do interventions, you can, in the short term, you can sometimes get pretty large effects, but they tend to fade out. So it's there's something there that seems to be, especially if you come from my perspective, there seems to be kind of a hollow core in this theory. And my suggestion would be it's because, a blank slate account of sex difference is just wrong. So if you're trying to build a theory about like an incorrect assumption, there's no way you're going to make major breakthroughs, because you're basically tying your hands behind your back, and you cannot entertain the explanations that are more fertile. So that said, of course, you don't want, I don't want to deny that socialization plays a role. And that, again, obviously social processes that exist and learning exists. Again, it can be biased by individual predispositions, but certainly you can do things that, for example, in schools, take one example, you can arrange things in a way that will maximize sex differences and really exaggerate them, or maybe constrain them a little bit, depending on what you want to do. Then that's your choice. But so, for example, some things are not very intuitive. For example, mixed when you have mixed age groups, that's kind of an interesting thing. That's been an argument actually by some evolutionary developmental psychologists about school interventions, but the fact that let's say modern schooling, you really segregate children not by sex but by age. So everyone in the same class is the same age, more or less. And then and at some point you get, for example, teenagers, like you have a bunch of 13-year-olds and they're only hanging out with other 13-year-olds. It's kind of a nightmare.
Yes.
But and that will tend to exaggerate, reinforce some patterns, that exaggerate some behavior patterns, because there's no constraints on that. If you look at more traditional societies where children actually don't spend time in segregated ages, but older children and teenagers also play and hang out with smaller children. And what you see, for example, is that there's a lot more. So this kind of context, it tends to trigger, for example, more caregiving from older boys. Less aggression. You tend to reduce aggression a little bit. So there are elements of the context that can tend to reinforce and exaggerate some differences. For example, when you have for example, media. So sex segregation by gender is something that's very cross-cultural in childhood. Boys and girls, at some point, they tend to separate into non-overlapping groups. Then you will have, of course, you will have some boys and girls who actually, for example, like to play with the group of the other sex. So there's of course variation, and there's children who don't kind of fit the behavioral pattern of their kind of sex group, and so you have this kind of variation. But that's a very robust pattern. At the same time, if you add to that, for example, I don't know, enough technology so you can have, for example, media like cartoons and stories and activities that can be actually fed and tailored and specialized very specifically for boys versus girls. I mean, I would expect that to have an effect, to exaggerate the difference to some extent. So I'm not saying that socialization is doing nothing or is not interesting to study. The problem is whether your account kind of starts with socialization and sees socialization as the main driver. I think creates all sorts of weaknesses and problems for the theory. And also what it does create is a bit of a chicken and egg problem at two levels, and I've alluded to that. And one is on a micro scale. Let's say, a lot of the studies, of course, mean you can do some experimental work, but you can't really manipulate environments in dramatic ways or completely change. So a lot of the evidence is correlational. And so correlations can be explained in different ways. So for example, let's say that parents tend to treat boys and girls slightly differently on average. Well, is that because parents are driving it, or is it because boys and girls on average are kind of eliciting different types of behaviors from parents? And it goes on like that. For correlations between, say, parent stereotypes and children's behaviors, is that because parents are transmitting their stereotypes to children, or maybe there's some kind of genetic confound or whatever, because all those things are helpful to some extent. So, the causal story is difficult to tease apart. And on a bigger level, the really big chicken and egg problem for socialization theory is, where do these stereotypes and expectations come from? Because the idea is that either by reinforcement or modeling or some kind of more cognitive processes, children are kind of absorbing a set of expectations and roles and rules and whatever that are tailored to their sex. Now the problem is, okay, sure, and then they will transmit it to the next generation and so on. The problem is, okay, where do those expectations come from? Or they just at some point just arbitrarily created. And the fact that across cultures there are some patterns of difference that tend to be very stable and don't seem to go away very easily with cultural changes, that is a problem for socialization theories, because it's basically everything. It's just a process oriented. Theoretically, for pure socialization theories, you could have genders, sex stereotypes about males and females. They could be completely arbitrary. You could have societies in which the stereotype is that women are rude and aggressive, and and men are timid and whatever. So you could it actually different types of stereotypes could actually come together in very interesting random combinations. So the fact that, you know, they actually tend to come in packages that are cross-culturally pretty stable and over time pretty stable. Of course, I mean, okay, this has been said a bunch of times, so I don't need to restate it once more. But I think socialization theories, well, they do add something interesting. I think where they kind of fail is that they can't really deal with these chicken and egg problems. Mm-hmm. While adding an evolutionary layer will definitely do something for that. And this is where you have this kind of interesting hybrid, which is social role theory, which is Ellis, and Wood. I mean, they've been proposing this theory where what they do is essentially probably, well, the thing is the kind of the minimal version of a biological theory that will kind of kickstart the socialization process and explain why the roles and expectations and behavior are not arbitrary and variable, but cross-culturally stable. And the proposal is, just to summarize, is basically that you have pretty robust sex differences in things like size, body size, body strength, the fact that pregnancy and childbearing are women do the childbearing and whatever, breastfeeding, or so there's some really strong physiological and physical differences between men and women on average. So not on average, for a very long time. Because of these differences, there's a very kind of natural way of divide labor between the sexes. So tasks that require more physical, strength and larger body size and whatever tend to be, specialized for men, and tasks that have to do with caregiving and other things, they go to women. So you have physical differences that are evolved somehow. Those drive division of labor, and the division of labor is the source for the stereotypes and expectations and social roles. And they talk a lot about they link to the interpersonal circumflex, so they speak a lot about the agency and communion differences as a result of tasks, social tasks that have more to do with, say, again, you can think of, say, hunting, fighting, manual labor versus caregiving, family-oriented activities, and so forth. So that's kind of the story. And it does, it tries to solve the chicken and egg problem of socialization theory by, starting from division of labor based on physical characteristics.
Yeah, but then again, that theory doesn't explain where those physical differences come from, right?
Well, yes and no. Because, for example, for let's say reproductive differences like pregnancy, that's clear where that comes from. So it's not entirely, and you can think, sure, you can think that, for example, differences in size and strength have been, say, sexually selected. Some people try to make the point that maybe it's just phylogenetic inertia. It's kind of, implausible. But so anyways, at least you have some grounding. But the thing, and the criticism to that theory has been that it really seems, if you read their papers, that they're proposing that biological evolution has only shaped physical traits and reproductive traits, and the behavioral differences are all a consequence of socialization driven by division of labor, which is driven by the physical traits. That's what a lot of people get from their papers. And and there's criticisms because, of course, and then another criticism is, even if this is how it starts, let's say there's point in time, millions of years ago or whatever, when you have the physical differences, you start doing the division of labor, and at that point is just kind of the behavioral differences have no biological component. Which again, I would say it's very implausible, but let's say, but at that point, because you have stable division of labor across many, many, many generations, there's going to be selection for behaviors associated with the physical traits. That's very strange to think that selection shaped the traits drive division of tasks and labor, and that doesn't in turn select for differences in behavior. It's very, you really have to explain why that doesn't happen. They really don't do that. So you have this kind of I guess the pure socialization, I don't know how this theory has been received, like in the more kind of, let's say, whatever, committed environmentalist camps. I don't know if it's been successful, but I think that maybe that's even a bit too biological for pure socialization theorists, right? And for people who are more come from an evolutionary kind of more evolution of behavior perspective, it seems to be just a bizarre theory. Why would evolution shape differences in the body of males and females and not follow through with differences in the brains and the behaviors that drive the bodies? Plus, there's one more way to argue is that okay, there's been of course fitness benefits and costs associated with these roles, but also now let's say you have a societies in which you have very stable division of labor between say men doing things like again hunting, physical defense and fighting and whatever, and women doing more of the caregiving and like social networking. And okay, now your success in these social niches is going to affect your status and social connections and so forth. So now there's also going to be a layer of sexual selection. So if so let's say if you're a man in the social roles that have been specialized for men and you're especially good at them, for example, because in addition to being say stronger and bigger, you're also say more aggressive, there's going to be some sexual selection and maybe some social selection for individuals who actually happen to fit their niches particularly well. So it's very hard to see how this theory doesn't lead into evolved differences in behaviors as well. You see what I mean? I mean, you've been and you interviewed Ellis, and what I really found interesting in your interview was that so again, I think it's the writing style they have sometimes a bit I think it's a bit obfuscating in a sense. In the sense you try to pinpoint what they're actually saying about something, and sometimes not very easy. But you raised this objection. So you actually, raised the objection with Alice Eagley and said, okay, but why would you expect in evolution to also act on the behaviors instead of just the physical traits? And she said two things. One was that she doesn't deny that evolution has actually shaped behaviors, but she's more interested in the part that's socialized, which that's good to know, because at this point we can start maybe arguing about, say, the relative strength of those two factors. And to be honest, I don't think that's the way in which a lot of people who adopt this theoretical framework actually think. I think there's general feeling that this theory is able to explain a lot of behavioral differences without specific selection on behavioral traits. Mm-hmm. And she just it open. She said, no. I mean, I think there are evolved differences. I'm just more interested in this other part. She's okay, then, which is fine. I mean, it's great. The problem is, what's the balance there? Yeah. Are you also saying they are more important? And then the other thing she said, which I think is a very interesting point, and it's a good point to where you can have an interesting conversation. She said, physical traits like size and strength, they are very robust and stable and fixed between the sexes, while behaviors are much more malleable. And this is the reason why you can look at behaviors in kind of anchor the whole thing to the physical traits and think that behavior will respond to, again, socialization and role following and so forth. And that's kind of interesting. And she made one particular example was that in some countries you have women in the military, mm-hmm. which kind of I think she was using that as kind of proof that even if women are still, not as big and strong, physically strong as men, their behavior can, is malleable enough that they can go to war and become soldiers and so forth. And my response to that is, that's very interesting. What about female bodybuilders? Because the, average female bodybuilder is stronger than me, for sure. Probably stronger than the average man. So it's not even the case that physical traits like strength and other things are completely not malleable. Mm-hmm. Okay, things there are other things that are less malleable, but no, some physical traits actually do respond to training and experience and so forth. So including physical strength. So where does that leave us? The other thing is, I would actually challenge quite strongly the idea that behavioral traits are so malleable.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what the evidence for that is. And I think that's an interesting debate. We don't need to have the debate right here, right now, but I think it's an interesting point for debate that it's usually not. I think people tend to just intuitively assume that behaviors are malleable. Because, of course, I mean, you're there. I can ask you to perform pretty much any behavior. You can do it. It's not, what limits you. You can behave in any way you want. And actually, I don't think that's true. I think that's true only for, no, I actually, I would make a strong case because, yeah, behavior looks malleable if you're talking about, short-term behaviors. If I ask you to do, ask you to yell at me, maybe you're a very, gentle and non-aggressive person, and ask, just yell at me, just punch me. It's like, you can do it. It's not like you can't. Problem is, first thing, if the behavior is malleable on the long term, that's a different story, right? Then it matters if the behavior is like an everyday kind of mal behavior or more extreme versions of behaviors. For example, again, who's going to kill other people in war? Because it's one thing, to participate in war. Sometimes you need to have people, soldiers just kill other soldiers in cold blood. And that's just a one-time behavior, right? And I actually think that the sex differences will be more pronounced there. People, and even individual differences. Some people, it's one thing to say, okay, slap me in the face. Pretty much anybody can do it. Not everybody, really. If it's, okay, just cut me with this knife, a lot of people will not be able to do it. And if it's go there and just kill this person, there's actually, depends on the context, of course, but you're restricting the. So what I'm trying to say is that the idea that behavioral traits are much more malleable than physical traits, I think it can be debated. And can be debated, especially when you're moving from everyday behavior to kind of more extreme versions of behaviors, like more higher stakes examples of behavior. It becomes less malleable if you're thinking about long-term patterns instead of okay, you can do this today. Okay, I can be maybe I'm an extroverted person. I like to be around people. I love it, and today I can stay home because I have to study for an exam. Okay, you can still do it, right? It's not like you. But if I ask you, if you're a very extroverted person and I ask you to, has happened recently, like just be locked in your house for 3 months. Now, some people are really not going to like this. Some people are just going to settle into this very easily. So long-term patterns, more extreme instances of behaviors, those I would dispute that they're so malleable. If there's some traits that are like, let's say, one sex differences in let's say empathizing, so theory of mind kind of abilities and so forth. Are they highly malleable? I don't know. I mean, what I know is that people, when you have people trying to teach these abilities to, for example, autistic patients, that's not that easy to do. It's not actually easy to teach, train people to be more empathetic and have better theory of mind skills. It's actually pretty hard. I think it's harder than weightlifting, to be honest. So and so on and so forth. Notable examples come to mind. I mean, for example, there's one example I will raise. Pornography, visual erotica, which is something that you have a very strong sex differences. What men like a lot and women less so. It's not a complete difference, but it's a pretty strong difference. And there's been attempts for going back to probably the 70s or 60s or 70s to sell more of work because it's it's very lucrative to sell more pornography to women. Mm-hmm. As far as I know, this is not working. I mean, people have tried in all sorts of ways, and it's still you get, maybe you can do it a little bit, but by and large, it doesn't work. You still have so is that difference malleable or not? I mean, it doesn't seem to respond very well to the sort of manipulation you can actually do in societies. So All right. This is not to say that behavioral traits are not malleable; they're completely rigid. But I think it was so interesting in that conversation that she raised the point that it's an assumption that usually goes unstated, and this is that behaviors, kind of by definitions, are more malleable than physical traits. And I think that's an interesting point to discuss. And there's reason to think that, especially when you're thinking of long-term patterns by large groups of people, and especially as you move to a more extreme version of behaviors, I would actually dispute that behaviors are much more malleable, unless you do some kind of coercive, form of intervention and so forth. But this is not what social role theory is proposing. It's not like that people are, you see what I mean? It's more about falling into social roles and following expectations and so forth. It's not really about people being coerced necessarily to do one thing or the other. So yeah, and I think it's just a very interesting point to discuss. And of course, I mean, then if you accept that some behavioral differences might have an evolutionary history in the sense of being selected for differently in men and women, then of course you're kind of fully in the realm of let's say evolutionary models of behavior. And I guess this is going to be our last ish.
Yeah. So I mean, throughout the interview, we've already been talking about evolutionary explanations, at least for some of the behaviors that we talked about. In general terms, is there anything that you would like to add to how we approach the differences between men and women, sex differences from an evolutionary perspective, or not?
Sure. So there's a yeah. I mean, and thank God we don't have time to do a full overview. But just I would probably say a couple of things. So one is that so when you look at biological theories, there's basically two big kinds of explanations, and one is based on sexual selection, which means selection that's based on either competing within with other members of the same sex for mates, or being chosen by the opposite sex. So mate choice and mate competition as drivers of differences, and that's one it's very important explanation. Is one is that sometimes very controversial precisely because it's so powerful. And what I want to say is that the first thing is you find a lot of criticism of sexual selection ideas, sexual selection theories that is just not very good, which is maybe focusing on some really specific findings or some models that people are citing, are actually, they are a bit outdated. So, but what I want to say is that there actually is a very strong support for some generalities about sexual selection across species, and so yeah. So what I want to say is that sexual selection theory is invoked very frequently by evolutionary scholars. Of course, it's also criticized a lot precisely because of that. I would probably say that a lot of the criticism that's around is not very deep or very strong. So, for example, I mean, there's been criticism about patterns being very inconsistent across species and very variable. So, in some species you find, male and female roles go a certain way. In other species, they're a bit different, or even reverse in other species. And so one criticism, especially when people rely on examples from other animals, there's been, pick your species, make your point. Yeah, you can see, look at this particular species and you find support for, say, traditional sex roles, but look at seahorses, and then it's males do the caregiving and females compete, blah blah. Sure, the problem is this variability is largely follows some patterns. So it's not random variability, but you actually can explain it depending on the mating system and the ecological niches of different species. So that's actually adding power to the theory, not subtracting power to the theory. And the other thing is the support is actually pretty good. The models are pretty strong. Of course, one thing I want to say is that there's a basic version of sexual selection where you start from differences in gametes. Mm-hmm. So that's where it starts, right?
and at some point you have divergence between, say, egg and sperm, and now you have two versions of gametes in two types of individuals. And that will affect the strength of sexual selection on males versus females. And as a result, you have a cascade of things, including more parental investment in females, more stronger competition in males, and this will reinforce some patterns and contribute to that. Also, there's feedback on the sexual selection part. So now these models this is the basic model. You can refine it a number of ways. Mm-hmm. And you also, which is done less often, but it is done, and people have argued that based on the same principle of sexual selection, you can predict that you will find some general patterns in a certain species, but also you can predict which kind of, say, individual factors might affect your choice of strategy. For example, if you're, let's say, a large male versus a smaller male, the payoffs are not the same, for example, for competing versus doing parental investment. So you might expect some flexibility, or depending on aspects of the ecology. For example, how many potential mates are around. Sex ratios are important. How many males relative to females in a certain population can change the mating dynamics quite a bit, and there's models that suggest that the behaviors of the sexes could shift a little bit. And also evidence in humans that, for example, things like, again, sex preferences for, say, committed versus short-term uncommitted sex, and even some kinds of aggression, they actually vary between populations and groups following changes in the sex ratios. Mm-hmm. So, and that's not in contrast with the basic idea of sexual selection, but it overlays a layer of flexibility and strategic variation over this basic pattern. The other thing is sexual selection doesn't necessarily create one type of males and one type of females. That's very important. It gets missed so much in discussion. Sometimes the selection is, because there's competition within each sex, selection doesn't really push everyone to the same extreme, but it promotes diversification. Mm-hmm. It depends on the options that you have. And so you will see in many species that, for example, this usually happens more strongly in males for a number of reasons, but you see alternative strategies. And some males will, for example, become larger and more competitive, and other males more territorial and whatever, or go for completely different kind of mating tactics and so on. So sexual selection doesn't necessarily generate uniformity. It can generate variability. And I think in humans, where you have plenty of social niches, for example, plenty of different ways, alternative ways to gain social status, which are, for example, don't depend necessarily on being strong and physically aggressive, but you could do it that give you prestige in terms of whatever, skills and abilities. Or our courtship system is interesting. We have some amount of reciprocal choice. So for all these reasons, you do expect, actually, in humans, and I've been arguing that these mechanisms of sexual selection will tend to create some average differences for sure, but within each sex you will have also a push for variability and differentiation, which is also why the idea that gender stereotypes there's one stereotypes for men and one stereotypes for women, I don't think that's even true. And I remember when I was like teenager and stuff, you have these things going around, 5 types of men. You see what I mean? Or yeah. the 4 types of women, and I think that's implicitly a recognition that, our mating and sexual psychology is not one kind of male, one kind of female. It's actually pretty differentiated and interesting. Psychopaths, Baron Cohen has proposed, like autistic traits, like, let's say, nerdy, whatever, autistic kind of traits are an extreme of the male brain. At the same time, psychopaths are another extreme of the male brain. They don't look the same. Right? There are things that are, on average, stronger in males, but they also get differentiated within each sex. And I think that's actually a very important point to make, both in terms of communication, because you really don't want to give the idea, it's a very false idea that an evolutionary perspective will force you to think that men are like this and women are like this. I mean, sure, there are patterns. Some patterns are pretty strong, but you can actually have biological reasons to think that, A, the sexes will show some flexibility in their behaviors, not necessarily depending on the things, say, sociologists worry about, but they will. And also that selection will sometimes drive differentiation, not uniformity. The other thing is, this is kind of counterintuitive for a lot of people, that to the extent that sexual selection is stronger for males on some traits, like there may be displays, or you can also expect that those traits will be more vulnerable to, say, disease and mutations and all sorts of environmental stressors. So, which is kind of, it seems to contrast with the stereotype so much, but actually sexual selection might also tend to make males, to some extent, more fragile and vulnerable to some, aspects on the environment or their genetic makeup, precisely as a way to make those traits better as signals. And this is, doesn't seem, it really doesn't fit with the idea that it's kind of sexual selection theories as just, say whatever, sexist patriarchal theory that reinforce traditional stereotypes, and well, then that doesn't really make sense. The theory actually predicts that men will be more vulnerable to all sorts of things and more fragile in their development than the women are, and so on and so forth. So I would say, to my conclusion, that's the sexual selection part. Of course, it's not everything is about sexual selection. This is where maybe you get closer to the social role theory, and partly as a result of sexual selection, but males and females, to the extent that they occupy different social and ecological niches, for example, in terms of what how far they travel in general, or the kind of things they do to gather food, or the kind of social networks you create, there's going to be selection within, differentiated selection for males and females without sexual selection being the main driver. So for example, caregiving, parenting, can be a powerful source of selection that is not necessarily, you see what I mean, driven by choice or mate competition. So sexual selection is a big chunk of the explanation, but you also have this kind of, to the extent that males and females occupy different niches, there will be selection within the niche for perform well in this particular role. So if I have to, I actually prepare, here's where I want to end, is some kind of takeaways from a biological evolutionary view of sex differences. And I think there are some takeaways that are, one is that sex differences are real. they run pretty deep in our psychology. They're not going away anytime soon. So that's kind of the first insight. The second insight, which is very powerful, is that biological theories can explain differences but also variability. And they explain why some differences are robust and kind of stable, but they also can explain why differences can be flexible. So the idea that evolutionary theory are reductionist and fixed and rigid and so forth, that's really not true, and actually would urge more people to embrace them, because they actually give you a way to make sense of the variability that otherwise it just doesn't make sense. It's very puzzling. Then from sexual selection, you have this very powerful insight that men and women have been shaping one another for millions of years. And the reason men are the way they are is because women chose them and made them that way. Selective breeding. We've been breeding one another as males and females, and which includes, it doesn't mean that the other sex is everything we want. But the reciprocal shaping can also be for traits that have all sorts of cost and benefits. But I just think this perspective is so powerful because it's a compassionate perspective. Some of the things for example, men tend to, for example, like about women, and also things they don't tend to like about women, can be traced back to matrix, the way men choose women over time, and same for women choosing men over time. So this reciprocal shaping of men and women is just a thing that if you take the time to digest it, it really changes your perspective on a lot of things. And sometimes you have cost and benefits intermingled. Let me just one example that's I use in class, but the male preference for younger women in terms of physical attraction. It's a very, it's very robust, and men tend to like, younger women, which is, again, other primates don't. they actually don't have a preference for younger women, for younger females. They tend to prefer more mature, sexually mature females who already have offspring and so forth. Now, and this is a trait. Here's the thing: this preference in men is incredibly annoying. I mean, for women, this preference of men for younger women and the tendency to see that as more attractive is incredibly annoying. To be honest, I mean, it's the source of a lot of stress and a lot of issues and all sorts of things. The reason why men have a preference for younger women most likely is because we tend to form long-term bonding, long-term pair bonding that lasts for a long, long time, which is, however, something that women tend to prefer. Mm-hmm. And this is the paradox. Precisely the fact that in humans, men are not just, copulating and running away, but actually can stick around and form long-term relationships and even long-term monogamous relationships to some extent. That's exactly the deeper reason why men are so attracted by features that signal youth. Mm-hmm. And things women tend to, on average, like. One of the other thing is incredibly, stressful and annoying and all sorts, source of all sorts of stress. They're two faces of the same thing. Mm-hmm. Kind of thinking, and this kind of thinking really changes your perspective, and it ties into the fact that traits have costs and benefits. Very few traits are all good or all bad, and before you kind of condemn some kind of sex differences as uniquely bad, you have to think if maybe there are some offsetting benefits in some context and so on and so forth. And the final point, which we haven't talked about, but it goes back maybe to last time, relations within each sex and between the sexes. If you take an evolutionary perspective, you will see an inevitable mixture of cooperation and conflict. Mm-hmm. This applies to both relations within and between the sexes. So if you put it all together, right, sex differences are real. Biology can explain variability, but also stability and flexibility, differences in variability. Men and women are shaped each other over time, and traits have cost and benefits, and will reflect a mixture of cooperation and conflict. That's a lot. It doesn't necessarily match with the standard mainstream narratives about men and women. And I think if you digest it, it's not just a more sophisticated way of looking at this, but it's also a source of compassion, and it's a perspective that can be quite strongly liberating. Mm-hmm. This is where I want to end. It doesn't necessarily make you happy all the time, because some of this mess, it would be nice if you could avoid conflict between the sexes. Turns out, from biological standpoint, probably you can't. I mean, you can reduce it a little bit, but there will be some sources of conflict that you can't really eliminate. So it's not all good news for different people. But I think if you really take the time to absorb it, it gives you a incredibly liberating perspective, and a perspective that allows you to have compassion for men and for women, and for people who say fit the gender stereotypes, and for people who don't, and you can make sense of a lot of complexity in a way that's not, let's say, how to say, it's not leaving you in a sea of confusion or resentment or stuck with differences that shouldn't be there and they're still there, and what are we doing wrong, and which is something, a bit of an outcome of the standard narrative. Because if you take let's call it the standard blank slate feminist narrative about sex differences, it's a perspective that, it's paradoxical, because it offers itself as liberating, but in practice what you see is that it creates a lot of confusion and strife. Because, for example, you think some differences will just go away if you do X, Y, Z. Then you do X, Y, Z and it doesn't happen. And now, what's going on, right? What are you doing wrong? Is this some kind of, you're looking for more invisible influences and all sorts. It actually can take you down a path where you end up with more confusion and more, and it doesn't necessarily help empathizing with the other sex or other people within your sex. I think a biological perspective, at the outset, it sounds like it's more rigid and whatever, which is actually not. I think if you digest it, can actually be psychologically liberating. That's what. And when I say this, sometimes I get really bad reactions because some people hear this is what I'm saying is that people should just, whatever, be put in their place. And just accept that, men are like this, women are like this, and this is it, and you have to conform, and that's what you should be doing, which is not what I'm saying, really. This is why I say this perspective needs to be digested a little bit, and you have to, really work through the implications, and then it becomes liberating. Otherwise, you either, move from one set of stereotype or rigid stereotypes to another, and becomes just antagonistic, or, you just, I don't know, you get the wrong message because you're reading what comes from an evolutionary perspective with the lens of the standard narrative, and it just seems like people, I'm personally right now, telling, whatever, women that they should be in a certain way and that, blah, blah, blah. So that's interesting. But I don't think there is research on whether, beliefs about sex differences, correlate with, say, well-being and happiness or mental health and so forth. But I have a hunch that actually having a model and an understanding of sex differences is more tilted toward this, what I'm defining as a biological model, can actually, help people in a sense of, make them kind of happier and and more resilient. Not tested, so I don't have data for it, but it would be nice to run a study and see if it's true. Anecdotal evidence, which is paradoxical because this is not what you expect based on the terms of the debate you see on whatever the internet or whatever. It looks like if you take an evolutionary perspective, you're going to get just depressed and locked into these rigid roles and whatever. I think it's pretty much the opposite, but.
Yeah. Okay. So, Dr. Del Giudice, I don't want to take much more of your time, and I also have another interview to do in around 1 hour. But could I just ask you? Could I just ask you one quick last question? That is, we've been covering over these two-part interview sex differences in all different kinds of domains. We covered a lot of ground here, and we've explained basically where they come from, or at least the main theories behind them. And how they work, what are the differences, but I have a last question, that is, let's say that I am a lay person and doesn't know anything about evolutionary psychology or sex differences, and I don't really care that much about the theoretical side of things. Why study these differences? I mean, what do we have to gain by acquiring this knowledge?
Oh, wow. Well, it maybe kind of has. I mean, again, they're not going away, and it's one of the big just facts of life and behavior in society. I mean, you have males and females. It's hard to find anything in daily life and social issues and stuff that doesn't have an angle that involves males and females. So sex differences are not just a niche interest; they really pervade. It's really hard to do a realistic psychology without including a big chunk of sex differences and similarities. I don't think you can understand the social world or understand human beings without that. So there's a basic understanding, I think, motive. And then, the other point I'm making is that I actually think that gaining some kind of realistic and reasonably sophisticated understanding of some of those things can actually be personally useful, personally, liberating and helpful in one's personal life. And again, I do think that right now a lot of the narratives that people get about sex differences are maybe not helping them personally too much, because they tend to be either, antagonistic one way or the other, or very kind of narrow and constrained, or just try to explain away some important things that people, continue to have to deal with, even if you try to explain them away. So that's not a recipe, I think, for healthy kind of healthy personal and social life. So I actually do think that, for other, and I think, curiosity and understanding must be the primary drivers of science. So I'm not motivating research based on kind of applied benefits necessarily. I'm super happy with people and myself, studying things that have no consequences whatsoever for people's happiness or well-being, just out of curiosity. But for sex differences, I do think there's, a very immediate benefit if you enrich your view and entertain different perspective on why sex differences are the way they are and where they come from. It can actually help, because every one of us, we're all dealing with, males and females in our lives, either as, partners and friends and competitors and children and parents. There's no way of getting out of that, right? You'd rather have a good model of what's going on. And I actually think, it's not just an intellectual thing. It really does fit into, the way you interpret reality and the kind of emotions you feel in interaction with. But again, I'm not saying, a good understanding of sex differences makes you just necessarily happy all the time. There are some realities about sex differences that actually can be a bit challenging or even a bit depressing, depending on how you look at them. So you don't want to discount that. There's some bad stuff in there. The point is contextualizing the bad stuff and understanding it. That does make a difference, instead of just being faced with it or interpreting it in ways that just make things worse.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, Doctor,
sorry. There was a wonderful.
Okay, great. So, Doctor,
sorry. There was a wonderful interview, and thanks for staying with me for such a long time. Thanks to the viewers for making it to the end.
Yeah, and by the way, let me just mention again your book that was the topic of our first conversation, Evolutionary Psychopathology, a Unified Approach. It was a great read. It's a massive book, but very, very interesting. And just before we go, just very quickly, would you like to mention again what are the best places on the internet for people to find your work?
Oh, well, I have a website. It's my academic website. You can link that. I think you mentioned that the last interview, but we had that exchange, me with other, David Schmidt and others. We had an interesting exchange about, say, controversial topics and issues in sex differences with Cordelia Fine and others. And you link that exchange if you want to link that again. Also because we provide some pointers to books and papers and literature. So actually, I think that's a nice place to see how a, let's say, reasonable and I think reasonably effective conversation about these topics can happen, even between people who are, let's say on different camps in this debate. But also, in doing so, we actually provide a lot of pointers to, books and things. And and again, I would probably say, hey, I have a bunch of books here. Can I have books that are not mine? I think it's a really good introduction. I would recommend.
Oh, yes. I've had Dr. Stuart Williams on the show. So
that's a very nice, if you want to kind of go to the pro level on what's the evolutionary perspective on sex difference, in all the details and all the, so not just like a pill version of it, but kind of the real thing with all the the evidence layout and all the controversies and where the theories come from and some of the complexities. I would just keep recommending Dave Geary's book, Made Female, which is it's substantial, so only get it if you really, really care about it. But it's a really good book. And now this is the second edition, and I think the third edition just came out, like last month, like I think in June. So it's also kind of up to date and really nice. So if you want to, especially if you're let's say you come from a research background, maybe you're a psychologist and you're skeptical of the evolutionary approach, or what I've been describing as the evolutionary approach. You probably, if you just read like a short version of it or a popularized version, you're not going to find enough material and enough detail to really engage with it at a deep level. I think David's book is just what you want to read.
Okay, so I will try to link all of that in the description box of the interview. I don't know if YouTube will allow for it because there's a limited number of characters there. But anyway, I will try to include as many sources as I can. And Dr. Del Giudice, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Bye.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And I also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and main supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett, Peruga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Leibrant, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, and Yacila Deza Araújo. My producers is our Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Gidi, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.